Hi, Professor Rick Rapetti here. Today we're going to talk about one of the ancient post-Socratic philosophers, Epicurus, who founded the school of philosophy called Epicureanism. We're only going to talk about one problem that Epicurus raised. It's often called Epicurus's riddle, or the puzzle of Epicurus, or any such names. And it has to do with what we call nowadays the problem of evil, which is something that all of us have experienced. Well, hopefully some of you haven't yet, you youngsters. But if you've ever been exposed to malevolence, male means bad in Latin, Spanish, Italian, and other Romance languages. And volens comes from volition or voluntary, which has to do with the will. So malevolence is ill will or bad will or evil will or just evil, right? But not just the problem of evil, but if you've had faith, if you grew up with faith or belief in some kind of divine order to the universe, a higher power, a God, a Holy Spirit, or whatever it is, and someone you love experiences some tragedy, or you yourself, one of the most natural questions to ask is there really a God? If God is a benevolent, loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing being, why would he allow that? Would he? Maybe he wouldn't, right? Okay, so this is a riddle that Epicurus raised about 300 years before the Common Era, or before Christ, depending on how you want to word it. So I have a little PowerPoint that I have created to discuss this, and I'm going to play it and chit chat while it's playing. Okay, so yes, the problem of evil. And I don't know if this was ever raised in Asian philosophy, this specifically, but it's definitely in Western philosophy, this is the first occurrence of this problem. So Epicurus, if you recall, lived around the time of Socrates, maybe a little later than Socrates, or so that therefore later than Plato and Aristotle. I forget the dates, but in my second lecture on, my next lecture on the post-Socratics will be post-Socratics lesson 1 or lecture 1, Epicureans and Stoics, right? So we'll talk a lot more about Epicurus's philosophy, or the Epicurean philosophy, in that video. This will be a much shorter video because we're only addressing one little problem that he raised. And I mentioned his time frame because although there were philosophers at the time who doubted the gods, right? You know, Socrates got into trouble for doing that. But Epicurus was very blatant and straightforward about it, as you will see. He directly argues against the existence of God with a capital G, like the one all-powerful, all-knowing, allegedly all-loving and benevolent. Bene means good in Latin languages, Romance languages, Italian, whatever, like bueno or whatever, Spanish, or buono in Italian, or bonjour, right? Good day in French. Benevolence is good-willed, good-natured. Malevolence is evil, right? So he raised this problem for belief in the God with a capital G, but it could apply equally to the gods if, like Socrates and Plato, you believe that the gods have to be good in some way, right? Like, so the Socratic paradox is, you know, the god Apollo seemed to have claimed that Socrates was wise. The gods don't lie, Socrates thought, but I don't think I'm wise. So how could I be wise in a way that I don't even know, right? Well, let's not repeat that again. But the point is simply to remind you that most of the Greeks at the time still believed in the gods, okay? But I guess by the time of Epicurus, he seems to be talking about the one God, okay? All right, so here's some pictures of, you know, evil characters. This one you know from popular movies. This is just a picture of something evil off of the internet. Woo. But here's the historical, like, tell me you don't know what the next picture is going to be, because it's the last picture and it's of an actual human being who many believe personifies evil. Yes, you guessed it. There he is. That guy, Adolf. I won't say much more about him. All right, so let's go right into the riddle or the problem of evil, the puzzle that Epicurus raises. Oh, I forgot that I did that to just kind of emphasize things. I had the picture of the one real human who's really evil blown up. So here's Epicurus's riddle. And you might have English teachers who say, you don't put an apostrophe S after a name ending in S, but some of us disagree, okay? Epicurus's riddle. You wouldn't just say Epicurus riddle, right? So in order to pronounce the second S in print, it makes sense to me anyway, and many others, to put the apostrophe and an S after it. But this is a stylistic preference. Okay, here it is. All right. Let's go through this line by line. It's only like a paragraph long. This is the shortest reading. And if you did the reading, you already read this, right? Okay, but here it is again. If God is willing to prevent evil, that means he has goodwill. He's benevolent, not malevolent, right? But he's not able to, he's incapable of it, he lacks the power, then he is not all powerful. Omni means all in Latin, and potent has to do with potency, power, right? He's not all powerful, right? So think about it again. If he's willing or he wants to, if God, who's supposed to be the most powerful being in the world and the most good-natured being, really is good-natured, right? Then he wants to prevent evil. But if he can't prevent it, then he's not all-powerful. If he was all-powerful, he could create a world without evil in it. Okay. Third line down, starting with a capital anyway, the third line, it's the fourth line on the screen. Pardon me, in brown. If he is able, meaning he is all-powerful, but not willing, he doesn't want to prevent evil, then he's not all good, he's not benevolent, he's malevolent. And in the concept of God on the table, we're not talking about like the god of war, Ares or something like that. We're talking about God with a capital G, right? Or if, as Socrates seemed to think, the gods have to be good-natured, moral exemplars, right? Then they're not supposed to be malevolent, right? Certainly in the monotheistic tradition, God with a capital G in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is not evil-natured, which is what malevolent means, right? God is benevolent. He's all loving, right? And merciful and so on, right? He's got all these wonderful virtues. He's the perfection of all values, is God, right? Okay, drop down to the next line. If he is both able, meaning he's all powerful, and willing, meaning he's all good, he's all benevolent, he's all loving, then where does evil come from? And this translation is, I guess, from older English. Then whence cometh evil? All right, of course, Epicurus came like way before English. So this is just an old translation into English. And he didn't speak English. He spoke Greek, right? Where does evil come from? Okay, that's the question. Like, if there's a God, why is there evil, right? Why is there evil? That's the problem of evil, right? Like I mentioned before I showed any slides, right? If something horrible happens to somebody you love, including yourself, but you believe in God, you feel challenged in your faith, right? How could that happen, right? So last two sentences, or two lines, really, one sentence, last sentence, last two lines. If God is neither able, meaning he's not all powerful, nor all good, nor willing, then why call him God, right? Because God, apparently Epicurus, seems to have the idea that the Jews, Christians, and Muslims have, that for a being to count as God, he's got to be all powerful, the most powerful being in the universe, and the most benevolent being in the universe, right? The most loving, all loving being in the universe. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims will add one more omni characteristic. God is supposed to be omniscient, where you see the scient part is S-C-I-E-N-T, which is from the original, I don't know if it's Greek or Latin, but it means knowledge or science. Science means knowledge, really. It comes from the same word, right? So if God is not all powerful, omnipotent, all good, he's willing to prevent evil and wants to prevent evil, then he would be omnibenevolent, all good-natured, right? If he's not that, and Epicurus leaves this out, but if he's not also all-knowing, right, then why call him God, right? You could imagine, like, if you might be accustomed to thinking about God in such a way that you don't seem to think all three of these things are absolutely essential. But think about it. Suppose, just for the sake of argument, that we're living in a simulation, like a matrix or a virtual reality that's just so realistic that we think we're in the physical world, even though we're not, right? And suppose some nasty teenager, like we're all avatars of his, and he's just having fun with us, right? And he's wicked, right? Like he's the creator in some sense, if he's all powerful and all knowing because he wrote the program and everything, but that, right? For you to think that he would be morally worthy of being treated like a god, other than out of fear or the hopes that if you appease him a lot, he'll be nice to you, right? No guarantees about that, right? That's what Epicurus's intuition is, that's not, why call him God, right? You might want to call him the creator or the master or the boss, just like a mob boss or something, or some kind of tyrant ruler, right? Or an evil king. But, you know, if you live in an area that's overrun by gangs and there's a gang lord, right? Like the mafia, what do they call him? The boss of the mafia, the capo di tutti capi, the head of all heads, right? The godfather, or whatever you want to call him, right? You might want to be on good terms with him and be respectful, right? You might even want to go to him for help, you know, but that's at a cost, right? But you wouldn't automatically, just because of his power, worship him and love him and be devoted to him from your heart, right? It's a matter, you know, unless you're also evil, then you might, right? But the point is, you know, I'll say a quick little story. When I lived in Bensonhurst for many years, and I used to jog marathon training in the neighborhood. I'd run around the neighborhood miles on end. And there was a mosque, you know, a Muslim temple on, it was like something like West 8th Street. I think that's still Bensonhurst, just off of Bay Parkway, around Avenue S, I believe, between R and S or something like that. It took up a quite large segment of the block off the corner, and it had a banner on the wall up near the roof of it, carved into the stone. It said, "No being is worthy of worship except Allah." And Allah means God for Muslims, right? It's supposed to be the same God, but they disagree about who's got the last word from that God, right? I would emphasize the word worthy, just to make the point that Epicurus is making. No being is worthy of worship except one who deserves that name, Epicurus would say, one who's not only all powerful and all knowing, but all good, all loving. Otherwise, it's just like a gangster, cosmic, powerful being, right? Well, like I said, a kid running the simulation, right? Or something like that. Or imagine in the future, you know, suppose we could find out that we were created by some genetic engineer who's an evil scientist, and we're like his lab experiments or something like that. Just because he created us and has all sorts of control over us doesn't mean that he's worthy of our respect, right? Morally worthy. The word worthy of worship, of really completely being devoted to and trusting a being. They have to be trustworthy. They have to be worthy of your trust and your loyalty and your devotion and your love, right? That's the idea. Okay, so that's the way Epicurus puts the problem. Now, atheists, ever since then, remember, a theist, not an atheist, but someone who we would call theist from the word theo in Greek, which means God, or Dios in Spanish, Dio in Italian. Dieu, I think it's in French, D-E-U-X, right? They're all based on the same word. An atheist, put the A in front of it and it becomes negation, right? So a theist believes in God, an atheist doesn't, right? So the atheist has taken Epicurus's reasoning and turned it into an argument. Now, remember in a previous lesson, when we did Aristotle, who invented logic, I told you that arguments have at least one premise, if not two or more, but one conclusion, right? So what's his name? Epicurus is just reasoning, if this, then that, if God, but he doesn't come out with a conclusion, right? He just ends with a question, why call him God, right? But buried within his reasoning, you can extract an argument, and that's what the atheist does, all right? Premise one, P1, or proposition one. If there is and I put traditional in parentheses, God with an asterisk, because I want to explain what I mean by this in a moment, both by traditional and by the word God, then there would be no evil or imperfection in the world. You could just take out imperfection, right? And just imagine evil is anything that causes you to suffer. So if the world is designed in such a way that the world itself, hurricanes and diseases and things like that, cause people to suffer, those are kind of like natural evils, right? That maybe aren't intended, but they're consequences of the world not being designed perfectly by a loving, all-knowing, all-powerful being, right? So that's the idea in premise one. But like I said, you could just drop out imperfection and summarize everything as evil. So if there's a God, then there would be no evil in the world. And that's definitely an idea from Epicurus, right? If he's all powerful and all loving, then why is there evil? Because the intuition is that if God is all powerful and all loving, then he has the ability and the will and the desire to create a world without suffering, right? And he has the power to do it, and he has the goodwill to do it, to want it. So if an all-powerful being wanted to do something, nothing could stop him, right? So that's what premise one says. If there is a God, then there'd be no evil in the world, right? If God, then no evil, to summarize, right? Okay, so let's break down what we mean here. So there's my asterisk at the bottom of the slide. Set aside other God ideas. There's other conceptions of God, or plural gods, or, the God of thunder, this kind of God, that kind, Native American gods, the Great Spirit, Quetzalcoatl, whatever. Isis, the Egyptian gods, Ra, the sun god, forget about all those gods that come from what we call a pantheon. Pan means all, and theon, gods, right? The pantheon is the league of gods. Forget the plural gods. This argument, and remember, Epicurus's argument, is all about the one God, all right? And then in the Western world, ever since, the Roman Empire accepted Christianity, right? Monotheism dominated the European world, okay? So this is the monotheistic God, all right? So I'm not saying there are no interesting problems of evil connected with other religions, but we're focusing only on the one that dominated the Western world up until the scientific revolution. But many in the West, certainly in the United States, are still believers, right? And certainly in the Middle East, in the Arabic world, right? In the Islamic world, in the Jewish world, in the Christian world, is, billions of human beings who still believe in God, right? And they believe in the one God, right? They disagree about that one God, but we're restricted. This argument is restricted to the monotheistic, mono meaning one, theistic having to do with God, belief in God, right? The one God, okay? So now in parentheses, I put traditional to refer to that idea. The traditional idea of God has three major characteristics and some other absolutely essential ones, but these are the ones important for this argument. He's omniscient. There's that word science, and omni means all knowing. So if he's all knowing, then he knows how to prevent evil. If he's omnipotent, all potent, all powerful, as opposed to impotent, which means lacking power, right? If he's all powerful, he has the ability to prevent evil. And if he's omniscient, he knows how to do so, right? So an all powerful being has the ability to prevent evil. If he's all knowing, then he knows how to create a world without evil. And then the final and most important one, like why it says the word worthy on the mosque and why Epicurus said, then why call him God if he's lacking these other characteristics, is omnibenevolent, all good-natured, good-willing, right? If he's omnibenevolent, if he's all loving, then he wants to prevent evil or create a world without evil, right? So let's just go through those three omnis. If he's omniscient, then he knows how to prevent evil. If he's omnipotent, then he can prevent evil. And if he's all good, then he wants to prevent evil. So if the most powerful, most intelligent, and most loving being in the universe who created the world wants to prevent evil, knows how to prevent evil, and has the power to prevent evil, there should be no evil in the world, right? That's what premise one is saying. All right, so we broke it down just to make it clear. Premise two, look around. There's plenty of evil and imperfection in the world, right? I mean, just look at COVID and you having to do this remotely rather than get to be with me in class live and enjoy my wonderful personality face to face. I mean, come on, what kind of imperfect world is that? Okay, so, right, so look, remember logic. We said something like, if all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then it follows logically what? I'll repeat the first two premises. If all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then it follows logically, conclusion, that's correct. You're absolutely right. That all A's are C's, right? That's logical arguments, premises and conclusions. So let's look at this one, right? It's a different argument structure, but it's the same idea about transitivity, right? If the premises are true in a valid argument, then the conclusion must be true. It's already contained in them somehow or another. It's implied by them, right? So I'll summarize the argument just to make it obvious. There's too many words on the page there, right? So look up at Repetti now instead of at the slide, right? So look, premise one, if God, then no evil. Premise two, but evil. Conclusion, thus no God, right? If there was a God, there'd be no evil. Forget the explanation about all the characteristics of God. But if there was such a God, a traditional God, then there'd be no evil in the world. Premise two, but there is evil in the world, right? Conclusion, thus there's no such God. And I put the word such in parentheses just to emphasize we're talking about this traditional kind of God. If we just said, oh, there's no God, well, you might think, well, there might be another kind of God. Maybe God's all powerful and all loving, but he just doesn't know enough. He's not smart enough to prevent evil or whatever, right? Okay. So yeah, I mean, but that's why I say there's no such God. What do I mean? A God that has all three of those characteristics, right? This would be an invalid argument if it said there's no God as the conclusion, right? But it allowed a God to have two of those three characteristics. You see what I mean? Right? If there's a God, then there'd be no evil in the world. There is evil in the world, therefore there's no God. I mean, some atheists make that argument, but what if the creator used up all his power in creating the world and still knows everything, wants to help, but has very limited abilities to intervene? He used up most of his power, right? Like I said, so if he has any two of these three, some people might still want to say, well, he's still God, right? He's like our father, and so we should still love him no matter what. All right, but what I'm saying is the word such is in there. There's no such God. By that, I mean no God that has all three of those characteristics. That's the atheist argument from evil. If there was a God who was all knowing, all loving, and all powerful, then there'd be no evil because he could prevent it, should prevent it, and knows how to, and so on, right? Bam. Okay, let's move on. Let's consider, oh yes, I want to point out that that's a valid argument. Remember when we did logic, with which Aristotle invented, we had Venn diagrams and whatnot, and the point of assessing an argument to see whether or not it's good, it has two parts that you have to look at. Is it valid, meaning is the logic good? right? And then the other thing is, are the premises actually true, right? So the validity criterion, which is right up there, right, which tells you that the logic is good, is if, and I emphasized that when I taught this the first time, if the premises were true, then the conclusion must be true. That's an if-then. Premises could be false, but if they were true, the conclusion would have to be true. So remember my silly kind of example, something like this. Premise one, all frogs are whales. Premise two, all whales are cats. Conclusion, all frogs are cats. Well, you know what? There's nothing wrong with the logic there, but both premises are false, right? So that's a valid argument, but it's not, do you remember the word? Since the premises are false, it's not sound. If the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true, right? If all frogs were whales and all whales were cats, it's transitivity, right? It's like if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is bigger than C. It's just, that's logic, right? So if the logic is good, we call it valid, right? I'm saying that the argument from evil is a valid argument. The logic is good. I defy any of you to try to show that it's not, right? For extra credit when you write your essay on this. Okay, I don't know if I actually am going to assign an essay on this or on the next second lecture in this week unit. All right, the argument is valid. And, you know, when we use for, I may have pointed this out to you, Aristotle had category logic or categorical logic with sets, right? Categories like male, sibling, brother, and so on, right? Cat, mammal, animal, right? So those are, the logic is within a sentence applying to the categories in it. But when you want to do logic between entire sentences, we start with the letter P, right? For the categories, we start with A, B, and C. All A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's, right? But when it comes to whole sentences, like if there's a God, then there'd be no evil, right? You've got two sentences in there. There's a God, there's no evil. And we link them with the if-then, which that's what that arrow in between the P and Q represents. You might have learned this kind of thing in your math class in high school. If P is true, then Q is true or would be true, right? If there was a God, then there'd be no evil, or we'd be in an evil-free world, or however you want to word that. That's the first premise. P arrow Q means if P, then Q. If there was a God, then there'd be no evil. Second premise has a little squiggly, like a minus sign, but it's curved like a little sideways S. That's the tilde character, by the way. Upper left-hand corner of your keyboard on a laptop or a computer under the escape key, right? There it is, right? And we use that to mean negation. So, right? So first premise, if there was a God, there'd be no evil, or there's no evil, right? Second premise, it's not the case that there's no evil, right? So we negate Q, which Q stands for there's no evil. We're negating it. There is evil, right? Or it's not the case that there's no evil. The two nots, the double negation cancel out and it becomes a positive, right? Conclusion, thus, it's not the case that P, and P, if you recall, means there's a God. So not P means it's not the case that there's a God or there's no God, right? Those are equivalent. Okay, so the logic is valid, the argument is valid. All right, yes. And this is another chance for me to remind you a little bit about logic. That's why I'm doing it, right? We try to stuff in our lessons about things like logic, which are just abstract methodologies, but which we use all the time in philosophy, in whenever we have a lesson that makes it appropriate to stop, pause, and think about logic, right? So that's what we're doing here. So here's another example of an argument that has that same, what did we call it when we did Aristotle? Argument form. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? If it's raining, then the streets would not be dry, right? Second premise, the streets are dry, which negates the Q part. Therefore, it's not raining, right? If it was raining, the streets would be wet. Streets aren't wet, therefore it's not raining, right? Think about the logic of that. If it was raining, the streets would be wet. Streets are dry, therefore it's not raining, right? You look out the window and all you could see are the streets. They look so dry, There's no water out there. So you conclude it's not raining. Okay. All right. Question is it sound? And that's the other criterion, right? In order for it to be sound, it has to both be valid and all the premises have to be true, right? So, pardon me. The first premise, if it's raining, then the streets wouldn't be dry. That's obviously true. You don't have to look out the window to know that, right? It's just a common knowledge, right? The second one says the streets are dry. Well, to figure out if that's true, you have to look out the window, right? So the first one is obviously true. Are the streets dry? Depends on what day it is, what the weather's like, right? If the streets are dry, then both premises are true. And if both premises are true and the logic is valid, then the argument is sound. If it's either invalid or one of the premises is false, at least one or more than one, then the argument is not sound, okay? So getting back to the argument from evil, if you're a believer in God, right? The only way you could resist this argument from evil, because I'm insisting that it's just like the diagram, well, it's not a diagram, the thing with the symbols, P arrow Q, not Q, thus not P, that's the logical form or the argument form, that's the logical structure of the argument from evil, and that's a valid argument. And plug in any sentences for P and Q into this argument form, and you will have a valid argument. That's another challenge for extra credit. If you could create an argument where you've got a P and a Q, right, but that argument is invalid, and you could explain why, you will win the Nobel Prize in logic, right? Don't waste your time. All right, you might want to try it for fun. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm not encouraging it. Okay, so getting back to the argument from evil. Since the argument from evil is logically valid, the only way for you to resist the conclusion, which was, what do you recall? Thus, therefore, or whatever, hence, consequently, ergo, which is a Latin word, which means thus, there's no God, right? If you believe in God, you don't like that conclusion, right? So you can't reject that argument on the basis of, well, the logic is no good, right? You have to try to reject one of the premises or both of them, okay? Which one of those premises, if you're a believer, well, even if you're not a believer, you could still enjoy the philosophical exercise here, right? Which one do you think you could argue is false, right? Here's a reminder of the premises. Premise one, if God exists, then there's no evil. Premise two, there is evil, right? Let me pause for a moment here while you think about which of those would be hardest to try to show as false. The reasoning in premise one, that if there's a God, there has to be a perfect world, or the reasoning in premise two. There's no reasoning in premise two. It's just a claim. There's evil, right? Is that common sense obviously true? I think the answer is yes. And some philosophers and theologians, people who study religion, have tried, and some religions themselves have accepted doctrines that try to deny that evil is real, right? Like, it's not really evil. Or what do you mean by evil? But you know what? Most of us know that, well, you know what? Maybe instead of the word evil, we should put unnecessary suffering or something like that, because there's certainly suffering that appears to be unnecessary in the world. All right, but we'll stick with evil for now. I think premise two is nobody could resist that one, right? That's really going to be hard. So I'm not even going to try it here. We're going to focus on premise one. All right. But in order to do so, I'm going to pull in a distinction from a modern theologian and philosopher from the 20th century named John Hick. All right. And I did not put his name on the slide. This is a way for me to test to see if y'all are looking at the slides and listening to my lectures, right? So remember it, write it down. John Hick. This is his distinction, H-I-C-K, Hick, philosopher, believer, theologian. John Hick says, well, he tries to respond to the argument from evil by saying, well, there's two different kinds of evil. And, I think if you break it down, I can give you answers to how there could be both kinds of evil in a world created by the traditional God, by such a God who's all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good. Okay, so let's look at the distinction. Number one is moral evil, and that's what human beings cause when we sin and mistreat each other, right? Here's a list of such things that moral evil are expressed as. When we murder somebody, right, we unjustifiably take their life. Rape is some kind of unjustifiable sexual access. Racism is intuitively a morally unjustifiable preference for one group at the expense of the other, or something like that. Same thing with sexism, right? Treating the other sex as if it's less than the sex that you belong to, right? Theft is some kind of morally unjustified property acquisition, right? Well, we know, I'm just giving you examples. Lying is misleading, deceiving people in order to manipulate them. Hatred is obviously, there's no reason to hate anybody, right? You can kind of be against their behavior, but hatred also burns you, not just them, right? Jealousy is somehow or another wanting others not to have the goods that they have, right? There's something like envy and jealousy. It doesn't seem to be a virtue. It seems to be a vice, right? Greed, gluttony, pride, selfishness. The list of moral evils goes on and on and on and on and on, okay? Fraud and whatnot, cheating on your spouse or your partner, and so on. Okay, and then the other kind of evil is what he calls natural evil or non-moral evil, right? A hurricane is not a moral event, right? And a shark, if it bites off a surfer's leg, the shark doesn't have morals. It's just an animal, and that's what sharks do. Nature made the shark that way, right? So earthquakes, here's some examples of the kinds of evils. But when we use the word evil, we just mean things that cause what seem to be needless or unnecessary suffering for human beings, and maybe even also for other animals, right? Earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, mudslides, avalanches, droughts, hurricanes, disease, injury, illness, death, pain, COVID, right? All sorts of things. Okay, so those are the two different kinds of evil that, who was it? I hope you wrote it down because it's going to be on the quiz. John Hick, right? Modern philosopher and theologian. Okay, so here's an important word. What John Hick is about to do is he's about to try to justify evil. Not that he thinks evil is good. So that's like not enough words there. An attempt to justify the belief that a good God who's all powerful, all loving, and all knowing would have reasons to allow evil in the world, right? In other words, the idea is that premise one would be false, right? If an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving being has good reasons for allowing evil in the world, then premise one of the argument from evil is false. It would be false to say, if there's a God, then there'd be no evil, right? So that's what he's trying to do. And we call, in theology and in philosophy, we call the attempt to justify the goodness of God in the face of evil theodicy. And the word theo means God. And the disi part literally comes from a Greek word that means dikon, D-I-K-O-N, which means righteousness, right? God's righteousness or God's goodness, right? So it's a kind of philosophical attempt to justify God's goodness such that it would allow evil, right? Another way of remembering this word, mnemonics, M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C-S, mnemonics, is psychological strategies that you use to try to remember things, right? Like maybe associating somebody who you just meet, that their name is Frank, and you just try to put them in your mind's eye with the other Frank that you know. So you see them together or something, or whatever the trick is. Or like Roy G. Biv, R-O-Y-G-B-I-V, right? Red, orange, yellow, indigo, blue, violet, I forget, whatever it is. But that's a mnemonic device, right? So a mnemonic device to remember this word theodicy, which is important in philosophy and in religion and theology, right, is to forget the decon part for the disi, but try to think of the word dictionary or diction, right? Like in the word contradiction. So you see the same root, D-I-C. That's not the root here, but you can make believe it is for mnemonic memory association reasons, and think of, well, in Spanish, it's dice, or in Italian, it's dice, or dir, or dire, to speak, right? In Spanish and Italian. So you could think, what could God say? Or what could somebody who believes in God say to answer the problem of evil, right? That's just a way of remembering what theodicy means. If I ask you, you'll be able to answer me. Theodicy is religion's attempt to justify God's goodness in the face of what seems to be unnecessary evil. Okay? So what's John Hick's theodicy for moral evil? It's the one from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Free will. Right? If we did not have free will, we wouldn't really be people. We'd be some kind of puppets. Right? If everything that we think, do, feel, say, act was remote controlled by God, right? We wouldn't be real. We would be puppets, like a little hand puppet. Okay? You can't have free will without evil, Hick said. What does free will mean? You are free. Nobody's forcing you to make the decisions that you make, right? So you have a mind, you have desires, you're able to reason, you don't have to act on your desires, you choose freely to act on them, right? So God gave us free will so that we wouldn't be puppets of his, so that we'd be real people rather than puppets, Pinocchio, right? Before he becomes a real boy in the story, right? Well, we'll leave that aside, because how does he use his free will when he doesn't really even have any, right? But you get the point, okay? If you have free will, that means you're able to choose things, choose badly, and choose evil things, right? So moral evil is what humans do, and certainly the explanation for what humans do from a religious point of view, in monotheism anyway, all three major monotheistic religions, is that God gave us free will, okay? And so free will comes with the power to choose evil, and we often do, okay? Free will is what makes evil, at least moral evil, possible, right? Hick would argue that it's logically impossible to be a puppet and a free agent, a moral agent, which is what we mean by a real person, at the same time. That would be like being a round square. You can't be a round and a square at the same time. You can't be a true, free, moral agent person and lack free will at the same time, right? You'd be some kind of puppet robot or something. Okay, you can't have it both ways. And there's that saying, you can't have he wants to have his cake and eat it too, right? I don't know if you've heard that phrase. I remember struggling for quite a while to try to figure out exactly, I knew kind of what it meant, but like, if you eat your cake, you no longer have it. Another analogy is you want to have your salary and spend it too. Once you spend it, though, you no longer have it, right? Okay, so it's just a metaphor for you can't have it both ways. You can't both have free will and no evil, no human moral evil in the world. It seems logically impossible, right? But then the argument that Hick makes is, and because God is good, he gave us the gift of freedom, right? And our independence from him. He made us real beings in the image and likeness of God, meaning we have minds of our own. We have our own freedom and our own free will, right? We're better off with free will and the evil that comes along with it than we would be without both, right? Because to get rid of the evil, we'd have to get rid of the free will. But if we got rid of the free will, because we wanted to get rid of the evil, we could be in a perfect world, but we'd be like robots or cartoon characters. We wouldn't be writing our own script, which is what free will lets you do. It lets you become the kind of person you want to become and live the kind of life you choose to live. It's up to you. It's not up to God. God gave you that. If God exists, of course, we're just assuming for the sake of the argument, if there was a God, right, that could be a reason why God allows moral evil in the world because he thinks it's a good thing. And arguably, if you exist and you have free will, then you think your free will is a good thing, right? So that's Hicks' argument. We're better off with free will and some evil. It's the cost of having free will, okay? Otherwise, we'd be like this little robot family on the screen, in case you're not looking up at the screen. Imagine perfect robotic beings who are remote controlled by somebody with a, an iPhone and a cool app, all right? Yeah, maybe in robot world, you could have it where there's no evil, but there's also no real free will, okay? So here's my critique of the moral evil theodicy. Remember what theodicy means? Theo is God. Dice and diction means speech. What could you say about God allowing evil? Okay, so here's Repetti's criticism of the moral evil defense, or the religious defense of moral evil. I say it's a false dichotomy. Now, when we do the next lecture, you will hear this word dichotomy again from the Stoics. Dichotomy is just when you have two alternatives that seem to be exhausting the issue, right? Like either you're for me or you're against me, right? That's presenting somebody with a dichotomy, right? Either you're for me or I will conclude that you're against me and I will treat you as if you're against me, right? You're being presented with a dichotomy. Two alternatives that seem to be oppositional and they seem to exhaust the alternatives, right? So here's the dichotomy. I say it's a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is when you're presented with only two options, but there's really more than two. Could be three, could be five, right? So here's what I say, it's a false dichotomy. You either free and evil or unfree and good, right? Well, I think that's false. Why? Because it ignores degrees in between both options. You could have degrees of freedom, and you could also have a kind of benevolent nature in such a way that you're mostly inclined to choose wisely and choose well, right? Especially if you're given all the things that you need and you are given a kind of really good intellect so that you could see the benefits of being good and choosing wisely and everything, right? That kind of ignored here, right? And it also ignores what God can do. God can create conditions for us that really lower the degree to which we might be inclined to choose poorly, right? Like conditions for our brilliance, great IQ, and psychic vision. Let me pause for a moment, because in the religious picture, some of the prophets and saints, right, they have some kind of psychic vision. They have visions of what's going to happen and they could avoid it and this and that. Socrates even had visions about the future, by the way, right? So like, think of a criminal who thinks he can get away with something because he doesn't have good foresight about what the likelihood of getting caught is. He commits the crime, he gets caught. If he could see that he was going to get caught, right? If he was smarter, right? Maybe he would be less inclined to commit that crime, right? So that's what I'm talking about here. Or God could create us where our natures are very virtuous, right? Like we're just born, like some people are born, like Michael Jordan was born with a disposition and a skill to play fantastic basketball, right? Some people are born like Beethoven with great musical talent. Like, God can do anything, right? If God can do anything and knows how to do anything and wants to do everything, he could have built us that we're more naturally inclined toward the good. He could have made us stronger, right? So that we can control our emotions better. He could have made us more loving and compassionate and peaceful and happy. He could have also created conditions around us where we have an abundance and wealth and all good conditions so that there's almost no circumstances that ever arise where we would need to make an evil choice, right? Because often the reasons why people make bad choices is because their circumstances are really bad, or they've been treated really badly by other people who were themselves treated badly and so on. But in theory, if God knows how, wants to, and has the power to create us in all of these ways, he could have, right? So this thing about either you're totally free and there's lots of evil, or you're a robot and there's no evil, that seems to be a false opposition, right? There are degrees of freedom and degrees of goodness, right, that God could have in us and around us. That's my objection, okay? God could have rearranged the conditions to eliminate opportunities and motivation for evil choices, right? So like take Adolf Hitler again. God could have put more loving mentors and whatnot and role models in his life. Who knows what happened to that poor kid when he was growing up to turn into such an evil monster, right? Okay, and here's my example. Here's just some of the great, most well-known prophets, right? Like Abraham, Moses, Job, right? All kinds of bad things happened to Job, but he had the disposition to maintain his faith, right? Jesus, Muhammad. So like, obviously God could create some human beings who have free will and have all these other virtues going for them. And so they almost never choose poorly, much less evil choices, right? I think God was disappointed with one of Moses' choices. I forget what he did wrong, but even though Moses led the Jews out of bondage to the promised land, it was kind of like a punishment for Moses for some minor thing that he failed to do correctly in God's eyes, and God prevented him from actually entering the promised land, right? But I don't think whatever Moses did was some kind of horrible evil that we couldn't afford to have in the world, right? And you can take other people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all sorts of, people who made some poor choices in life, but they had free will and they weren't evil, right? So that's the point. Like this idea that there's either free will and evil or no free will and no evil, that doesn't seem right. That's a false dichotomy. That's my criticism of Hicks' moral evil theodicy. Okay, remember that. Oh, those robots are still there. Right. Well, God could have made us more like the robots, but still have free will, right? Okay, here comes Hicks' theodicy for natural evil. This one's trickier, right? What could possibly excuse God from making a world that has all these natural evils in it? One of the examples I like to use when I teach this is I've been collecting fish and having little aquariums since I was a kid, on and off, but for most of my life, I've always had at least one. And, over the years, you learn what kind of conditions in the aquarium are good for the fish, right? You need a thermometer to test the temperature. You need a heater to make sure that it responds like a thermostat to keep the temperature right for that species of fish. Some prefer colder, warmer. You need the right kind of lighting. You need the right kind of water quality, pH level, this, that, and the other thing, gravel at the bottom, and, filters to keep the water clean. You need to change the water and clean the tank and whatnot. You don't want the light to fall in and electrocute them, right? So a human being and fish are really very low on the scale of being able to experience pain or have emotional lives. But if you care about your fish, they're your pets, you set up the conditions that are ideal for them. So I'm making an analogy between the world that God created for humans and a fish tank that a collector sets up for his or her fish. We're humans and we're frail and we don't know everything. But when you try to do something like that, you don't set it up. You don't design it in such a way that periodically the light falls into the tank and electrocutes the fish or something like that, right? But in God's natural world, right, there are earthquakes and tsunamis and tidal waves and hurricanes and diseases and all sorts of things that happen. But God is smarter and more powerful and more loving, according to the hypothesis that's being challenged here, when he designed the world and put us in it, right? So that's a problem. Like, that's why I'm saying in advance, it's going to be hard to come up with a theodicy for the evil that nature allows, because God created nature. He created the laws of nature and gravity and everything else, right? If there is a God. So here comes Hicks' theodicy for natural evils or non-moral evils. Well, we need a world with consequences in it. If there were no consequences, money that was stolen would miraculously reappear. Just a couple of these funny examples, without causing inflation or ruining the economy. And if you know anything about economics, you can't just keep printing out money because then it loses its value, right? Or we could eat 1,000 donuts without what? Two consequences that we normally face. One, Oh, there's both of them. We become obese, medically overweight, so much so that it's unhealthy, right? We get sick if we ate 1,000 donuts, or if you have that much sugar all at once, you can become diabetic, right? So a world without consequences, well, maybe you like the idea. I kind of like the idea. It would be nice if I could eat 1,000 donuts without becoming, so that one thing doesn't, I'm not so sure that's a good example. We could commit every kind of sin without ever getting caught, or without ever suffering any consequences, or without causing any harm. I guess, you might once again like the idea of this kind of fantasy world, right? But there's more to say about it. So theodicy for natural evil continued. If there were no laws of nature like gravity, you go, oh yeah, I fell out of my window when I was cleaning it and I went down, 30 feet and broke my back, right? That's gravity. If there were no laws of nature like gravity, there could be no science. Science is based on the laws. We learn what the laws are and we could build technologies and all that. We wouldn't know what to expect, like gravity. Well, let me pause with the gravity thing. You're playing basketball, you throw the ball up in the air, it misses the hoop, and it just keeps going off into space, right? When you jump up in the air to throw the basketball and it goes in the hoop, but you keep going up, right? No weather, no patterns, no seasons, no night and day. We wouldn't know what to expect if there weren't regularities in nature. We would be, and this conclusion right here, we would be living in a dream world or cartoon world in which everything is possible. This applies back to everything on the previous slide too, right? Because in dreams, right, you could have everything stolen from you and then you wake up and it's still there, right? Or you could eat 1,000 donuts and you think that you're going to be sick and you wake up and it was just a dream. Or you can commit all kinds of crimes in your dream and think the police are about to get you, you're going to spend the rest of your life in jail, or everybody who loves you is going to hate you. And then you wake up and you go, that was just a dream, right? So let's get back to that cartoon world thing, right? There it is. We would be living in a dream-like world or a cartoon world. You're watching cartoons and Wile E. Coyote is chasing the road runner. He falls off a cliff. It looks like the Grand Canyon, He goes down 1,000 feet, splatters in the ground. He's like a pancake, and then he just peels himself back up. Or Bugs Bunny shoots Daffy Duck in the face, and his beak spins around a few times. He's discombobulated, but then he's back to being Donald Duck again, right? That's a cartoon world. It's like a video game. It might be fun to live in a video game where you can never really die, right? But the problem is, and here it comes, if there were no challenges, right? All the challenges in a cartoon world or a video game or a dream are fake, and they don't have real world consequences. If there were no challenges, then nothing would really make any difference or matter to anything. In the same way, like when you wake up from a dream, no matter what kind of murderer you just were, or whatever horrible thing you did, or whatever wonderful thing you just won, the lottery or whatever, it's all fake, right? There's no real challenges, no contest, nothing would make a difference, right? Your dreams don't really make a difference. I mean, some of them have an emotional impact on you, but it's not the same as the real thing, right? Nothing would really matter. Might be fun for a while, but after a while, like, yeah, okay, go ahead, shoot me again, Bugs, In the movie, what was it called? Groundhog Day. I don't want to spoil it for you, but the main character played by, not Dan Aykroyd, the other guy from Ghostbusters, Bill Murray. Bill Murray? I think that's his name. Yeah, Bill Murray. He keeps waking up and it's the same day. So it's Monday. He has all of Monday, goes to bed, wakes up, and it's Monday again. Everybody else is doing the same things they did on Monday, except for him. After a while, he becomes bored to death. He just starts doing all sorts of crazy things because he's bored to death, and it's just like ridiculous, right? That's that idea from that movie, right? Here's the key. We could never develop virtues of character, virtues or character, right? Now, remember what Aristotle said about how important virtues are, and so did Socrates. They're the ornaments of the soul. They're what make you the kind of person that you are, right? Why wouldn't that work? Well, let me back up a little bit. Courage is a virtue, right? But could you develop real courage in a dream world or in a video game? No, because you can't really get hurt, right? In order to really develop real courage of character, that virtue of character, you have to actually risk serious danger and injury to yourself, one way or another, either physically or mentally or reputationally or economically or something like that, right? You couldn't be generous. You know what? Why don't you take it? I know you really like this. Here, you have it, right? I give it to you. Go, oh, how generous that is. And then poof, I've got another one right in my hand, what I just gave you, right? That's not real generosity. For it to be generous, it has to be something that by my giving it away, I've actually lost what I gave you, right? So that's the idea, right? In dream world or in cartoon world or in virtual reality, you can't really develop any real character traits or virtues, right? And that if that's the case, then your free will, whatever ability you have to make choices, right, to fight the dragon and all that, they don't really matter because the dragon can't really burn you or eat you or claw you to death, right? It just kind of looks like that happened, right? So free choices, free will would not matter to who you become, right? And it's important from the monotheistic religious point of view, the most important thing in this life is to become the best person that you can become spiritually and morally, to develop a cultivated good character, a set of virtues, right? So free will without a world of real challenges and real dangers is meaningless. Therefore, you need both free will, which allows for moral evil, and a non-cartoon world, which allows for your free choices to matter so that you can become the kind of soul, the kind of individual who earns a right to have a good relationship with God, either in this life or in the next. And for most religions, the next life also counts a lot, right? The afterlife, where you wind up, the good place or the bad place. Great show, by the way, on television. I don't know if it's Netflix or not, The Good Place. Okay. Yeah, so we can never grow up morally or spiritually. Just think about kids. When you were a kid, I loved cartoons, Saturday mornings, you know. I could live in cartoon land forever, but then you grow up, right? But if you're stuck in cartoon world, you'll never really grow up, right? I can still enjoy cartoons as an adult, but it's just mild entertainment. It's not the same thing. But when you're a little kid, you need to escape from cartoon world to become a mature adult in the real world, right? And to develop the kind of personality and character that you want to become with your free will. You use your free will to become the kind of person that you want to become. And that determines your relationship with God, according to religion, the monotheistic religions anyway. Okay, so now, just like, let me back up a little bit. I presented Hicks' theodicy for moral evil as free will, and then I critiqued it. I said, well, it's a false dichotomy, right? You could have some free will, a better nature, etc. Then we moved on to his theodicy for natural evil. Why does God allow the world to be so painful and dangerous, right? Now I'm going to critique that with a very similar critique of Hicks' natural evil theodicy, his defense of why God allows the world to be such a brutal place, right? Like I just said a moment ago, this is similar to my critique of the free will theodicy for moral evil, that it's a false dichotomy. It's another false dichotomy. Either we have the world as brutal as it is, or we have to be in a complete cartoon world, right? And there's no in between. That's another false dichotomy as far as I could tell. It ignores degrees in between both options, same as the other false dichotomy, right? God could have created the world with some tolerable consequences, some injuries, some dangers, some real consequences, some real challenges, right? But if God is like a parent, and I put parent-child in the parentheses there, right? Like when I'm raising my kids, right? They're raised by now, but when they were raised, you know, I didn't let them play with bombs and guns and knives and poisons, right? and I didn't let them go out into the street completely freely when they were 2, 3 years old, right? I exposed them to the kinds of developmental challenges and obstacles that were appropriate for their abilities at that stage of their development, right? And when they're really helpless, you put them in a crib, right? Where they can, or a playpen or whatever that's called. And, and you childproof the room. You take all the sharp things away and whatnot. You don't leave out pointy objects and stuff, right? So God is allegedly our parent and cares about us. He's all loving and he's all knowing. So he knows, like, he could have designed the playpen for the earthlings to be a little bit more childproof or person-proof in a way, right? But still have enough consequences for it to be real and not a cartoon world, right? There's a spectrum in between cartoon world and this brutal world that we're in. Maybe a little bit, in the middle would have been better. And God could do that because he can do anything and he knows how, right? God could have given us better bodies, stronger or more flexible bones, thicker skins, better brains. How do you explain how some of us are born with all kinds of deficits, right? And others are not, if before you're born, you haven't done anything to merit some kind of mistreatment or punishment from God? That's another problem, right? So, and God could have done that and still have gravity and all the other laws and the seasons and day and night and science and all the other reasons why, Hicks said, no, it's got to be this way, right? Okay, so, these didn't come up one line at a time, but try not to get lost in the whole page. But what I want to say is, even though my criticisms don't defeat Hicks' theodicy completely, they just show that there are problems with it, right? And technically, Hicks' theodicy enjoys a small victory here, but with some limitations, right? I think his argument shows that a loving, powerful, all-knowing God, right, could create a world that allowed some natural and moral evils in that world, right? For what Hick calls this moral development that you need free will and real danger for, he calls it soul making. Not like you don't have a soul. God gives you a soul, but it's kind of blank morally, and you make your soul to be good and therefore merits heaven, or bad, therefore it merits hell, right? In some way, shape, or form, right? Hick calls it soul making, right? You make your own. God gives you a soul, but you make what kind of soul it turns out to be, good or evil, right? So if Hick's argument is right, like God does have reasons for us to have free will, that makes sense, but maybe not infinite free will. And God does have reasons to allow both moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil because of free will, and natural evil because you need some consequences, right? But my argument is you don't need that much free will without better guidance and structure in the natural world and in ourselves, right? So both of those false dichotomies, but they don't undermine Hick's argument completely. Hick has still made a reasonable case that free will makes sense and real consequences in the world make sense, right? So therefore, he wins against the argument from evil, right? Therefore, it's possible for God to coexist with, for evil to coexist, rather, with an all-loving, all-powerful God, meaning it's not a contradiction. Therefore, premise one is false. Premise one, recall in purple there, says, if there's a traditional God, then there would be no evil or imperfection in the world. Hick has shown that that is false, right? A loving, all-powerful, and all-good God would want us to have free will and would want us to have serious consequences for our choices, and therefore there would be moral evil and natural evil in the world, right? The problem is that, forget the problem yet. That's the last bullet. Second to the last bullet. Therefore, the existence of evil is not inconsistent with God. So Epicurus is wrong, right? Then why call him God? No. An all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God could and would and should create free will and danger real free will and real danger in the world, in which case you would have moral evils and natural evils. Therefore, the existence of evil seems consistent with God, contrary to the argument from evil and contrary to Epicurus. So Hick wins on that front. However, last bullet, the degree of evil, right, and the extent of it, like the degree is how evil certain things are, and the extent of it is how much evil there is in the world. That's not consistent with a loving God. And that's where my criticisms of both of them, those two false dichotomies, kick in, right? God could have still designed a world that had free will and had danger, but doesn't allow this much evil and this horrible types of evil like Hitler and whatnot, right? Okay, so based on that criticism, my criticism, an atheist could come back. And by the way, I am not arguing for atheists. I'm arguing for and against, right? I'm leaving my Repetti's personal opinions out of this, although I'm making the arguments for the sake of argument. Like that's what philosophers do. Say, oh, that's Hick's argument. I see two flaws with it, right? And I can, someone who disagrees with Hick, the atheist could come back and make this argument, right? I'm not saying I'm an atheist, right? I'm more like Protagoras, the jury is still out for me. The question is really complex and life is too short, right? Okay. So the atheist can come back. That the atheists come back. Okay, Hick, you're right. Premise one stinks. But how about we revise premise one? Let's modify the argument from evil. If God exists, this is the new premise one. If God exists, then there would be no evil beyond the minimal amount needed for free will and a non-cartoon consequences involving world, right? In other words, if there was a God, there wouldn't be this much evil in the world. Premise two, but there's way too much evil in the world, a lot more than you need for what Hick would call soul making. You don't need this much evil for soul making. So how do you explain all this, right? If God's all that, then why do we have all this amount of evil? Then whence does this amount of evil come from, Epicurus could say. Conclusion, then there's no such God. RR is me, Rick Repetti, and I say that's a much stronger argument, and I'm not so sure what the answer is. Okay, so let's stop the screen, share, so that you get to see, we need to balance some of the evil in the world by showing some of the good, and beauty is part of the good in the world. And so is humor. So I hope that you find my remarks at the end of these lectures humorous. This is a serious philosophical problem, but it's also a practical problem because so many people, I actually do counseling. I've got training in psychology and I'm a certified counselor. I've got clients over the years that pay me to help them with their issues. And it often happens, and also in life with friends and family members that or students, just people that neighbors or whatever, and or that you hear about indirectly, that somebody like even somebody old, like 90 something, dies, and their 70-something-year-old child is so attached to them, right, that they just can't believe it. It damages their faith, right? But that's one thing. If it's that old, most of us will say, okay, I can understand it, but, get real. It's, that person's lucky they lived into their 90s, right? What's really painful is when an infant or a baby or an innocent child dies some kind of horrific death in an accident or in a fire or whatever, right? Car accident, whatever. That's hard, especially if you're the parent of that child, right? Because the child, a newborn child, is kind of like a droplet of heaven that's been dropped into your life, right? And it's so innocent and vulnerable and beautiful. They got that baby smell on their scalp and everything, and then they die. That's one of the most horrific things that could ever happen to a parent, even when a parent's 30-year-old kid dies, right? and they've got 7 other kids or something like that. It's very painful. But I want to mention the baby thing. Focus on that just for another minute or two before we end the lecture here. The reason why is most of us would think, well, you know what? It's your karma, whether you're 30 years old or 10 years old or 90 years old. It's your karma, it's your time or whatever. You made your moral choices and God has God's reasons, right? But when it comes to a child, and this is a problem for Hick, because Hick says that the justification for both moral and natural evil in the world is soul making, right? God gave you free will so that you have this one life to make the kinds of choices that would make you eligible to be in a benevolent relationship with God in this life and in the afterlife. And for most religious believers, the afterlife is the eternal one that matters the most. This short life is a blink of an eye in eternity, right? But an innocent child who hasn't made any choices yet, hasn't cultivated enough free will, and doesn't even know right from wrong yet. They're like Adam and Eve in the garden before they ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're morally innocent. So they don't get to use their free will. They don't get to make their souls. What happens to them? How do you explain them in Epicurus's God's terms, right? So I'll give you, I think 2 other religions have an answer to that. And some Christians and Jews, I'm not so sure about Muslims, but some Christians and Jews, they're a minority, throughout history have believed in one of these 2 ideas. Well, I already mentioned one that we all seem to believe in, something like karma. Bad things happen to you because you did bad things, right? That maybe he did something really bad. That's why, we don't know what people do. And he must have done something bad if God let that happen to him, right? So that's karma. Call it what you will, right? You reap what you sow, it says in the Bible, right? What comes around goes around, or what goes around comes around. It's a Brooklyn motto, right? Little babies don't do anything to have anything come around or go around, right? So how do you explain? They don't have any karma. Well, Buddhism and Hinduism, 2 major religions that we're going to talk about toward the end of the course, Asian philosophies and religions, they both believe in reincarnation. Like I said, some Jews and Christians have believed in reincarnation. I'm just not familiar enough with Islam to know if any Muslims throughout history have believed in that. But if reincarnation and karma are both true, and almost all religions believe in karma, some version of it, you reap what you sow, it comes around, goes around. But if we've lived before, and we've been living before many, many, many times, if not countless lifetimes, right? Then we've got karma already from many, many, many previous bad choices and good ones, depending on what we chose, right? So the theodicy in Hinduism, let's just say, would be, because Hindus believe in souls. In Buddhism, it's disputed whether or not you have a soul, but you've got something that reincarnates, right? So that's a kind of philosophical debate not worth having here, whether or not what reincarnates is something, anything like a soul, okay? But in Hinduism, so let's just stick with that for a moment. In Hinduism, you have a soul and it's been born into many, many bodies and done many, many, many things. And almost all of us have pretty much done almost anything to everyone at one time or another. And, if horrible things happen to you in this life, you've probably got some really bad karma from previous lives, right? So if you're a baby, you're really not innocent. You're innocent so far in this life, but you've got a lot of karmic baggage that you're carrying over from thousands of previous lives. Maybe you were a Hitler-like character in a previous life. And so maybe you burned babies when you rampage through a village in a warlord attack or something like that. Who knows, right? That's the idea. So I'm mentioning this just to make a contrast, because the argument from evil, remember, is only about this God or such a God, the traditional monotheistic God, right? Whereas the gods in Hinduism is a much more complicated thing, as we'll learn later on this semester, right? But their theodicy seems, if you were just going to try to weigh two religions to find, or two sets of religions, to see which one seems like it has gods that are more benevolent, right? All omnibenevolent, all loving, right? It seems like a God who gives you one lifetime only and allows innocent babies to miss out on heaven for eternity or something like that. And the other religion that says everything that ever happens to you, you caused it, but you get an infinite number of chances to fix it. And that's what life's all about. When you finally learn everything, you graduate into a higher place, right? So Hinduism seems to have not only a better or more compassionate theology, a theodicy, right? An explanation for evil. That in Hinduism, you could explain why God allows horrible things to happen to innocent babies, right? It's hard to do that in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, right? So if that's your criterion, which religion is more compassionate, the God of which religion is more compassionate and forgiving and gives more chances and everything, Hinduism wins that debate. So we'll say a lot more about Hinduism later in the semester, but that's about it. It's certainly a lot to think about, and I hope that I got you to think. All right.